Hi, everyone. Welcome to Module 5. My name is Chloe Edwards. It's been great to get to know many of you through this course. I've really enjoyed listening and hearing some of your stories and your perspectives as you navigate all of these different topics. So this week's topic for Module 5, you're exploring conflict resolution, communication, and restorative practices. I think this really blends a lot of what you all have been learning together, ranging from social identities and intercultural communication strategies, as well as biases. So I'm excited to dive into this topic. I have some personal and professional experience with restorative practices, but what are they? So restorative practices, they're evidence-based. I'm going to talk about them within the context of the school environment. You all have a great source, which is titled A Promising Path Towards Equity, Restorative Circles, Develop Relationships, Build Community, and Bridge Differences. And this specific course talks about the disproportionate impact of suspensions, expulsions, or referrals to law enforcement on students of color. So could this apply to your profession? Well, for me, I identify as a Black woman, but I also identify as a policy director working on behalf of working class communities of color, and in particular, youth of color as well. And so restorative disciplinary practices are evidence-based alternatives that are used to reduce suspensions, expulsions, and discipline referrals. And this has an emphasis on fostering peer and staff relationships and repairing harm to the injured party. Those are all consistent principles with this practice. Now, while I'm talking about it from the school to prison pipeline perspective, restorative practices can also be used in the workplace. If you've ever or will work at an organization that may perhaps pursue a racial equity transformation, like for me, I have worked at a predominantly white institution that pursued a racial equity transformation where we engaged in restorative circles, which included formal apologies as well as the proposed solutions that everyone could agree to or amend or block. And so that's just an example of the school setting. I've used them in the work setting, and then you can also use these in one-to-one settings. I've used these as a certified yoga teacher as well when we talk about nonviolent communication and connecting, um, being more specific when we communicate to folks if our feelings are hurt, being more specific about what the issue was, how it made you feel, and what outcome you would like to see. So the source that I reference also discussed social emotional learning. And so in addition to my yoga practice, I'm also a certified social emotional learning facilitator. My yoga program specifically taught educators how to engage in mindfulness, wellness, and social emotional learning. So social emotional learning it may be applied outside of this diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of perspective that we're talking about throughout this course, but it certainly works as an enhancement and could work in tandem. So there are castle strategies that address 5 broad areas of competence in social emotional learning. If you live in Virginia, for example, your state might even have a formal social emotional learning curriculum for students. They address things like self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, responsible decision-making. And generally, this refers to the process through which we can apply a set of social, emotional, and related skills, such as attitudes, behaviors, values that can help direct students in the education setting, or more broadly, people in general. This can benefit people. But in reference to the source that you all were given this week, A Promising Path Towards Equity, Restorative Circles, Develop Relationships, Build Community, and Bridge Practices, bridge differences, I'm talking about that within that context. So as someone that works on education, justice policy, specifically, I have advocated for the implementation of restorative practices in Virginia. Now, how could restorative practices interchangeably enhance social justice in Virginia schools? Well, nationwide and in Virginia, there is what's called the school to prison pipeline. Many students with disabilities, students that may identify as LGBTQ, students of color are disproportionately impacted by the school to prison pipeline as it relates to referral to law enforcement, suspensions, or expulsions more broadly from school. And this is due to policies, zero tolerance policies that have disproportionately impacted folks within these historically marginalized communities because of implicit biases, which you all have been learning about today. For Black girls in my social justice work, I see the adultification of Black girls when it comes to, for example, dress code. For students with disabilities, there may be biases. Like you have a student that has a disability and often has these outbursts of different sayings, such as due to Tourette's or something like that. They may, get in trouble for those outbursts when really it's related to the disability. Also, students that may have, let's say, students that may have behavioral disabilities or more psychiatric disabilities. Again, some of these behaviors that you may see, for example, even PTSD, it could be a response of the student being triggered. Or if you have students with developmental disabilities, again, they may not be at the same age, they may be the same age, but cognitively may not be at the same age of development. So you may see more childlike behaviors, like, for example, when I worked in the foster care system, students who may have been a teenager, but cognitively were in elementary school, they may handle things, conflict, like a student that is in elementary school. And so a teacher may perceive that as inappropriate, when in reality, the student developmentally or due to trauma is presenting differently than other students who may have grown at scale with their developmental growth. So those are just a few examples. You could even look at English language learners, adjustment into from a different state here in America, Virginia more specifically. And so there's a variety of things to consider when we look at this data and see this disproportionality and its impact. There's a variety of things to consider. So in Virginia, in 2015, the Center for Public Integrity reported that student referrals to law enforcement were about 3 times that of the national rate. And so Virginia was the leading state in specifically referring kids from the classrooms to the courtrooms or law enforcement. And so 6 years later, the Virginia Department of Education issued model guidance for developing alternatives to suspension, expulsions, and referrals to law enforcement. And they named the school to prison pipeline as a key contributor to pushing students out of the classrooms and into the courtrooms. We know that punitive disciplinary practices, those zero tolerance policies, you're out of a school automatically, have been applied to certain student groups, leading to this disproportionate removal from school for students of color, those who identify as LGBTQ, students with disabilities, and/or English language learners. And so while schools must enforce rules and provide teachers with tools to maintain a successful classroom, these tools should not shut the door on educational opportunities for students. And while I'm looking at this through a diversity, equity, inclusion, or race analysis framework, these punitive practices harm all students, not just students that we see are disproportionately being impacted, but ultimately harm all students by creating a cycle of educational disengagement, possible involvement in the criminal justice system. More time out of school could also lead to more gang violence and lowered academic achievement more generally, which could produce lifelong obstacles. So in divisions here in Virginia that have adopted these restorative practices in tandem with social emotional learning, we see decreases in school discipline incidents, academic achievement increases, and students and teachers both learn valuable conflict resolution skills. So instead of just saying, you're suspended, they're actually able to engage more of what the good behavior might be that's modeled. They're able to learn that and then implement that. Now, in school specifically, there are several approaches to restorative practices in Virginia. Peer mediation is one of them. You could also do a mock court or peer jury. You could also assign a student a mentor. There's also the Virginia tiered systems of support. So if a school is seeing kind of a system-wide issue, let's say you have dozens of students that are chronically absent, then you may need to develop a tier that's going to develop a solution. You may need to implement a tiered solution that's going to target that systemic issue, because we're not just talking about one or two students, we're talking about dozens of students. And so the schools are able to develop a solution to address the systemic issue by identifying the root cause. So there's also positive behavioral interventions and supports. And so that is exhibiting the behavior we want to see from kids rather than punishing the behavior we don't want to see. And so that could be praise, giving students praise or a reward system or something of that nature to exhibit the behavior we don't want to see, but also we're not rewarding the behavior we do not want to see in the classroom either. Now, getting to for lobbyists like myself during the General Assembly session, this is when lawmakers come together each year to set the state budget, but it's also the opportunity to present new laws or ideas that could turn into laws. And so I work with the Fund Our Schools Coalition in Virginia and led the Safer Schools Subcommittee to propose policy priorities within the coalition related to safe and restorative schools. So in doing that, we had to navigate coalition dynamics, which is what one of your textbook references as a specific type of conflict. And so navigating coalition dynamics means ultimately we all care about funding Virginia schools, but we also may have different perspectives on whether restorative justice should be a component of that, or even some education on the issue and trying to understand. You may have folks that are more traditional when it comes to discipline, more punitive, and then you may have folks that may be a bit more progressive when it comes to their approach to to discipline. And we see this even when looking at parent-child interactions, differences in disciplining or modeling the behavior we want to see in kids. And so even though we're a coalition, that doesn't mean we have the same perspective on things. So I think the main issue of this bill from that coalition standpoint was doing some research, getting educated on the issue, looking at the history of Virginia. For example, there was a Classrooms Not Courtrooms campaign done by Governor Terry McAuliffe, and then looking at even modern data and producing an updated report on where Virginia stands, which is still one of those leading states when it comes to punitive discipline more generally. And so ultimately, they wanted to make sure that opening this section of the Code of Virginia, what we wanted to propose was the codification of the implementation of restorative practices. This is already a 2021 model policy from the Virginia Department of Education. And so we simply wanted to codify the model policy that already existed, but we wanted to make sure there weren't going to be any unintended consequences by opening up that section and calling more attention to that section. So once that was alleviated and folks were able, with the outcome of the elections here in Virginia, folks analyzed the political landscape and felt it wouldn't be risky to open up that section of the Virginia Code. We moved forward with the policy, but then we had to identify a senator to sponsor the legislation and a delegate to sponsor the legislation in each chamber. And so we were able to identify Delegate McQuinn, whose main concern was, is this something new that's being proposed, or is this something pre-existing? We were able to clarify that this was not a new ideology. It was already in the Virginia Department of Education's model policy. We were simply codifying it in the Virginia Code. And then there was Senator Pekarsky, who hails from Fairfax, Virginia, and whose district has been implementing a lot of these practices until she was very excited, but more of a new elected official, whereas Delegate McQuinn was a more senior elected official. So we see that kind of cultural difference already between the two elected officials, just notating that as well. So upon, excuse me, upon getting to the Virginia General Assembly, which began on January 10th, well, when there's a piece of legislation, this is a civic duty, a civic right to engage in the process. And so all of the bills are made public, and folks can express their support of the bill when you're talking about stakeholders or community members, but they can also express their opposition, y'all. And so when expressing opposition, this was something that we came across with different associations, for example, the School Board Association, the Superintendent's Association, even school districts, for example, Henrico County Public Schools was originally in opposition, different legislators as well, who may hold different perspectives on restorative justice in general. And so I'll just give you one example in working with the specific school district who opposed the bill. First, I noticed that there had to be some level of education done to resolve the conflict. The school district's original concern was expressed that, well, things like drug trafficking or guns, for example, this is forcing school districts to use restorative practices in those harmful cases. And so what I was able to do was direct them to the legislation, which actually had some exemptions due to the 1994 Gun-Free Schools Act. There are several exemptions in that portion of the code, without getting into laws, that actually exempt, that actually adhere to gun violence, drug trafficking. Those were already exempt due to the way the legislation was written. There were certain cases in which restorative practices would be exempt. Now, there was also some conflict with an elected official who actually is a teacher. Well, the good news is we had Virginia Education Association as a supporter who represented teachers, and teachers were actually prioritizing this, but it wasn't necessarily unanimous among teachers. Many teachers knew this was going to be a shift in their usual practices, and it would require some change that may not be easy, but 80% of teachers did agree that Virginia needed to move forward with this. And so by speaking to the senator, connecting him with one of our stakeholders, and then also addressing his concern, which was, well, if there's a behavior that's habitual or a threat that could turn harmful, we need to make sure these restorative practices don't have to be used. There's a level of flexibility for that. And so we were able to add another component of the bill, which would target aggravated circumstances defined by the superintendent. And then utilizing that actually covered habitual offenses, including physical, emotional threats, et cetera. So we were able to alleviate that concern. Now, there was a lot more to this. I won't get into all of that, but when you're pushing for legislation, there's a variety of different stakeholders, some in which you're able to resolve conflict with, some in which who are just going to be adamantly opposed. And so we did still have some of those outliers that were adamantly opposed. But I'll share the final roadblock. So we had to do that education with many stakeholders, but including legislators. But ultimately, the final roadblock was a pretty powerful legislator who chaired a subcommittee that this bill had to go through. Bills have to go through different subcommittees, committees, and they make their way to the floor, which is the House of Delegates, the Senate, and then eventually they got to be signed by the governor as well. And so I learned that there was simply some miseducation with the legislator who, when I say was adamantly causing some conflict with the bill, went to Democratic leadership and even expressed her concerns to Democratic leadership. And so this was kind of out of nowhere because she was a teacher at the organization I work for. She also was one of our endorsements. And so, however, upon speaking to her, I learned that she did not see the changes we made to the bill by adding in the aggravated circumstances. Additionally, I had to present the definition of aggravated circumstances to her and all that it would cover. And additionally, had to also point to some policies around her concern specifically was, well, what if a student comes up and punches a teacher? So I had to highlight sections in the code that already outlined a restorative practices for aggravated assault, specifically aggravated assault and battery. And then I also was able to be vulnerable with her by sharing my own story of how, as a triplet, I've seen different outcomes within my own siblings due to restorative practices. Me and my sister were placed in kinship foster care as teenagers, whereas my brother was not. And so even being able to connect emotionally with the interventions and the different outcomes it caused in my personal life, I could tell that she grew very empathetic towards the piece of legislation, but also mentioned that she had not seen the most recent version of the bill because it kind of skipped over, it went through her committee and the changes were made after that. So at the final hour, there was one more process of conflict the two legislators had to deal with. And this was within the patrons. The senator was willing to negotiate different things on the bill, whereas the delegate was willing to negotiate different things on the bill. So there was one version of the bill that was, I would say, the strongest version, which was requiring the initiation of these practices with those exemptions named. And there was a very watered down version of the bill, which completely removed the word restorative practices and changed it to leveled administrative responses. So what I had to do was go to each patron and see what their level of willingness was towards a happy medium. And then upon doing that, I also had to create a briefing that represented the coalition's perspectives and what we were willing and not willing to negotiate as well. And so through that, I've represented 3 different parties of people, the senator, the delegate, and the coalition, and all of them had to go through conference because ultimately when you're passing legislation, you can only pass one bill. You can't say the same thing has to be implemented 2 different ways. And so we were able to come to finally a happy medium, which was requiring the consideration of restorative practices, which means the coalition had to kind of back down on require the initiation, and then also added some data reporting to track the utilization of the practices given the legislation was watered down a little bit to consider. We wanted to see, okay, well, with the current language consideration, are the practices going to be implemented consistently across districts? And then, of course, those exemptions were put into place. So that represented the final version of the bill. Pleased to say the bill got passed on April 17th of 2024. The General Assembly will have the option to veto or move forward with the bill through signature of the governor. So now the next person you have to make sure is okay with the bill is the governor, who can sign or veto bills. And so happy to say we anticipate it will be a successful passing, but there was many conflicts that we had to navigate. Ultimately, though, it got us to the desired outcome with some negotiations that had to occur in mind. And I'm pleased to say that even some of the opposition that originally opposed the legislation we're able to at least get them neutral on the bill through those friendly amendments, adding in aggravated circumstances, and even adding in the data reporting help to get those who wanted everything required to somewhat of a happy medium too. And so this is how we navigated restorative practices in Virginia. To date, there's about 1,038 districts implementing Virginia tiered systems of support, social emotional learning, and positive behavioral interventions. And one day, I hope that every school will have the opportunity and the resources and the desire to implement this consistently to continue to decrease the impact of the school to prison pipeline on students of color, LGBTQ students, English language learners, and other historically marginalized students. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions as you're exploring this module. And please tune in to the announcements, including the reminder to adhere to those deadlines that are outlined. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll post my email in the announcement as well. Thank you all, and I hope you continue to have a wonderful day.